Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm Elizabeth McLaughlin. I'm Chair of the Planning Commission, and on behalf of the Planning Commission, I welcome you to tonight's discussion of the draft land use regulations. This is one of a series of meetings, I think some of you have been to them, for public outreach so that we can present the draft regulations and, most importantly, take your feedback. The Planning Commission in Brattleboro has worked most recently on the new town plan. The town plan was approved by the Select Board in 2013, and the Planning Commission immediately began to revise the land use regulations. Before we get started with tonight's presentation, I'd like to introduce the Planning Services Department. Rod Francis is the Planning Services Director, and Sue Fillion is our town planner. And now I'll turn this over to Sue, who will go over logistics and introduce our consultant. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for coming out tonight. Just a couple logistics. The bathrooms are outside this door to the right, and we have some snacks in the back, so please help yourself. We have lots of handouts that you might want to grab after the presentation if you haven't had a chance to get those yet. And we have some bigger size zoning maps in the back as well that we're happy to discuss with you. So I'd like to introduce Brandy Saxton. She's been the consultant that's been working with us since about April. Brandy is from the firm Place Sense, and I'm off the cuff because I left my notebook in the car. So Brandy is a land use planner. She has a background in design, landscape architecture, land use planning, and GIS analysis. Brandy has a master's in public administration as well as a master's in landscape architecture. So it's been a pleasure to work with her, and I'm going to turn this over to Brandy, who will talk about downtown and the surrounding neighborhoods.
So since we've got a shorter presentation and a small group tonight, I'm going to say if you have questions as I go along, just shout them out, grab my attention, and we can stop and talk about whatever interests folks as we go along. So I think most everyone here is aware of what is happening at this point, but the Planning Commission has undertaken a complete revision of the town's zoning and subdivision, and is bringing forth the first draft of that for public comment. And the reason behind a complete rewrite is really that the last time this was done, it was about 30 years ago, and some things have changed in the intervening 30 years. The town's planning goals and priorities have changed. The development trends in the town and region have changed. There's been changes to state law. There's been changes to what's considered good planning practices. And all of these things affect the regulations. And then over the years, there's been a lot of small amendments made to the zoning regulations. And after a while, a lot of small changes to a complicated document can end up with something that's difficult to administer with internal inconsistencies and such. And so that's really the reason for stepping back, taking a complete and comprehensive look at the regulations and revising. So to summarize what some of the larger types of changes are that are occurring, there's new zoning districts and adjustments to the district boundaries. There's been an effort to consolidate the zoning districts, so going from 19 zoning districts now to the proposed 12 in the draft, and adjusting the district boundaries to largely follow lot lines, streams, roads, and so fewer lots will have a zoning district boundary crossing through the middle of them. In a couple of cases here in Brattleboro, there's buildings that have a zoning district boundary running through them. So efforts to eliminate that type of thing, part of the zoning change. We're moving in a direction of broader use categories that allow for a wider range of uses in many of the districts. And then coupling that with more precise and specific technical standards. This gets to the idea of being a lot more concerned about the form and the physical form of new development, and a little bit less concerned about exactly what is occurring inside of the building, as long as it meets performance standards and meets sort of the outside expectations for that location. This is also a unification of the zoning and subdivision bylaws, which right now are separate documents, and so this is a good opportunity to bring them together so that they are all working off the same unified set of definitions, the same unified standards for streets and things like that. So there's a lot of consolidation there. And the document has been reorganized and restructured so that when you do look at it, it looks quite different than the current zoning. So the zoning changes affect some areas of town a little bit more than others, and some types of property a little bit more than others. Single-family property owners in the residential neighborhoods aren't really going to notice much changing. In the rural districts of town are changing very little as well. Lot sizes and densities and things like that are pretty much staying the same. Applicants that are subdividing land or proposing multifamily, commercial, mixed-use type of projects will see more of the changes affect those types of development. A lot of the changes are focused along the Putney Road, Canal Street corridor areas, and the area that's at the southern end of the downtown around Elliott, Burge, Frost Streets, that area of town. The core downtown area, West Brattleboro Village, and those residential neighborhoods have fewer things that are changing in the zoning. So after that introduction to what is going on, just a little bit of what we're going to cover in the presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the town plan as the guiding document that is the reason for the changes that are being made, the zoning map and what's going on with that in and around the downtown. And then I'm going to talk about each of the zoning districts that are in the downtown area. So, as Liz pointed out, the Planning Commission in 2013 rewrote and got the town plan readopted. And it should be pointed out that their plan won State Plan of the Year. I can say this because I had nothing to do with it, so I can brag for them. So that plan lays out some recommendations, one of them being that there should be a complete overhaul of the zoning and subdivision regulations, and then a bunch of much more specific things that should be changed in the regulations. And I'm just going to walk through a few of those that are most relevant to the downtown area. One of the recommendations relates to trying to create more residential occupancy in commercial areas and commercial structures. I think this is a good photo for that, showing, you know, the upper floors of some of these downtown buildings, having people living in them, lights on at night. There's a lot of reasons for this in terms of revitalizing the downtown, keeping it energetic, having people living downtown creates a market for the downtown businesses, provides housing opportunities that are, you know, the types of housing that people are looking for, smaller households and such. So a lot of positive things can come from that. And so some of the things that the zoning is doing to move towards this goal of creating incentives for the residential is to, for instance, require mixed-use buildings and multi-story buildings to increase the amount of building that would be allowed, the floor area, how much building basically you can get if the occupancy is going to be mixed, commercial and residential, in various districts. The plan also recommends encouraging more residential infill development within existing neighborhood areas and in the commercial areas that we just talked about. In response to this, the new neighborhood center district, which we're not really going to be talking about a lot tonight, but the earlier presentation that's available on the BCTV, actually, talks about the neighborhood center district in a little more detail. That is aimed at trying to encourage some of that infill residential development. We've also looked at opportunities for allowing infill in more of the residential parts of town as well. There's opportunities through PUDs to get higher densities and some other things that people could use that want to provide more housing in those areas that are already served by town services. The plan speaks to trying to provide appropriate standards that would then allow more light industrial activities to locate in the downtown and in the commercial areas. This is something that, for many years, industrial activities were thought to be kept far from residential areas and downtown areas and things like that because the impacts were incompatible. Industry has changed quite a bit, and now a lot of what is light industrial uses are not much different than office uses, and can be accommodated into a downtown very nicely and providing jobs and different uses for the existing buildings. So we've done that with performance standards, so that's standards that basically prevent nuisances, things like noise and lighting, odors, those types of things there are standards for. And if business, whether it's a commercial thing or a light industrial business, can meet those standards, then it could be an appropriate thing to go on in downtown. The town plan calls for design standards in many of the areas of town, including in downtown. A lot of this is just simply codifying what's already here and what people like. Storefronts, buildings that are multi-story, built close to the street, outdoor seating areas, signs that are scaled to the people who are walking down the streets, that type of thing. So there are standards in the zoning that deal with these aspects of development in the downtown and the surrounding neighborhoods. The plan calls for a historic district in the downtown area. There is a National Register historic district, but it calls for there being some special protections and a higher level of scrutiny of development that's occurring within historic buildings or affecting historic buildings. And so we do have an overlay district proposed for those historic registered districts that would require that changes to buildings be done in conformance with the Secretary of Interior's standards for historic building rehabilitation of historic buildings. Some of you have probably heard of the Secretary of Interior standards if you have any familiarity with historic building lingo. But those are national federal standards that are commonly used. They now have some really good guidance on how those general standards should be implemented. So there's actually, you can look at your building and be like, I have a brick building with a slate roof. You can go look at their guidance and say, okay, these are the types of things that are recommended for maintaining, repairing, replacing components of my brick or fixing my slate roof. And there's best practices of things that are compatible with your historic buildings and things that could potentially cause damage to the historic building and materials if you don't do them correctly. So the overlay district would basically require that projects follow the recommended practices that are in those guidelines. So reduce the impact of flooding and erosion. This is a big piece of what has been being changed in the regulations around stormwater issues. The photo probably speaks to why this is critical. In the downtown area, maybe there's not a lot that can be done to manage stormwater in the area that's already built out, but we're really addressing stormwater town-wide and working back upstream from downtown to hopefully prevent there being more water than this coming your way in the future. So I'm going to transition over to talking about the zoning map in the downtown. The basic concept here, I already discussed the idea of simplifying and consolidating the map. The urban center area remains. You have an urban center district now. There would be one in the draft zoning, and there have been some adjustments to the boundary, which we will look at. But then there's a new mixed-use district, and that consolidates a number of existing districts, and there continues to be a residential district. So this is the current zoning map for the downtown area. And as you can see, the white outlines are various different zoning districts of different colors. So in addition to the urban center, which is here in the very middle, this red, There's a commercial district, a commercial industrial district, a commercial office district, and then some industrial as well. So that's all of these purples and pinks that are running around in here. And then there's a residential office and a residential multiple residential. I can't remember which way it goes. District, and those are your oranges and yellows. So that's the current picture. This is the consolidated draft map that's being proposed. It continues to have this urban center here in the center. You can see there's been some shift in those boundaries, particularly this area in here. If you look, you can see there's some changes here, which we'll talk about the reasons for in a few minutes. We've consolidated down to one residential district where there had been the two districts. And a lot of those various pinks and purple districts that were the different types of commercial and office and industrial districts have been consolidated into some of this mixed use new district. So why make adjustments to the urban center boundary? When we put together the standards for the urban center, they're very much built on the idea of replicating and maintaining the traditional block building pattern. So you can go on the street and you can find this. You can see that there's an actual physical difference in the form of the building here and the one sitting next to it. This is now the boundary line of the proposed urban center district. It's where the building form changes. And a similar thing here. Well, these are both residential, multifamily residential buildings. There really is a difference in the scale and massing of those buildings. And so the urban center district has basically been reshaped a little bit around the edges to be better defined by that type of built environment where there's block buildings that are built either attached or very close to each other, built multi-story buildings built close to the street. And then as that building form changes, that's when the district boundary changes. So each zoning district is now set up to have design standards, and there are illustrations that sort of exemplify the aspects that the design standards are trying to get to. In the urban center, the idea, as I said earlier, is basically to replicate the historic pattern or maintain it in the cases where it already exists. And that's pretty basically your multi-story buildings built to the edge of the sidewalk or close to it, and a lot of them with ground floor storefronts. And so those are the types of standards that are included in the zoning district. Buildings can't be set back more than 20 feet in the urban center district. They have to be 2 stories and can be up to 6 stories in height. The floor area ratio, which we have some examples of as we move forward, that's how much building floor area there is to the lot area. It's a ratio. So a 4 here in the urban center district. There is no maximum residential density, so you could have as many dwelling units within a building as will fit in give you reasonably sized living. And there are no minimum parking requirements either. And in fact, we're continuing forward with the no creating of new surface parking in the urban center. And so you can see some of the other elements here as we look at the idea of trying to maintain regular patterns of windows on the upper floors, doing storefront designs on the lower floors, where buildings will be set back a little bit to create space for outdoor seating or a pocket park or things like that, but otherwise bringing the buildings right up to the edge of the sidewalk. So it's a lot of numbers to throw at people in what the dimensional standards are. So we're going to provide a couple of examples to illustrate how those numbers get applied. So this is the hardware store. It's on a 9,000-ish square foot lot. In the urban center, you have to have at least 2,000 square foot for a minimum lot size. It has about 50 feet of street frontage, this building. You'd have to have at least 30 for a new lot in the urban center, although probably not a lot of subdivisions going to occur in the urban center. The land's pretty much lotted out, but this building has basically 100% frontage build out. That means that the entire lot width is covered by a building. And you have to have in the urban center at least 60% lot frontage build-out. So that means that we will be establishing that and continuing that built form of buildings attached to or close to one another, like exists now in the downtown. So you couldn't have a big open gap in between. This is a 3-story building, and as I said, it could be anywhere from 2 to 6. The footprint, about 5,500 square feet, to give you a sense of the scale. With those 3 stories and considering the lot size, gives you a floor area ratio of 1.8. And so it can go up to 4. So we did have some discussion at one of the earlier meetings about whether a floor area ratio of 4 was going to be adequate, since 6-story buildings are allowed. And if you were to build the entire lot of a 6-story building, and cover the entire lot and build up 6 stories, that would be a floor area ratio of 6, just so you understand how the math works. But most buildings in the downtown area, perhaps not the entire building goes, all floors are not necessarily all the same size, so sometimes the upper floors get smaller. Sometimes there's additions that are lower or only 1 floor or whatever. And many of these lots have some amount that's not built on, whether there's some existing parking in the back or there's some service areas and things like that in the back. So that's the case with this building. There isn't a lot, but even a little bit, as you can see, can drop the floor area ratio from 3 conceivably down to 1.8. Yeah?
I don't see an overall height dimension there.
So in the district here, the maximum height is 6 stories. There is a provision that just generally applies throughout town about going over 60 feet. If you're going to go over 60 feet, that requires special consideration and approval, and the fire department needs to be okay with that, just in terms of being able to provide service.
So you said, so there can be a variance to go higher if it meets whatever?
So yeah, it could go up to the 6 stories, and depending on what the fire department's, if their concerns are met about being able to reach up, it could conceivably be more than 60 feet, but there is going to be a level of review if it goes over 60 feet.
Are there state laws that require that a building can't be higher than what your ladder truck can reach? It's certainly not in the city, obviously.
Well,
Let me answer that for you.
okay.
As far as I'm aware, there are no state laws that mandate a relationship between the ladder truck height and building height, but the fire department does review buildings for their ability to access them, and it's a concern that's taken seriously, and that would be one of the reasons why, when we reviewed a building that of a certain height, the permit could be denied, because we weren't able to provide that level of fire apparatus isn't going to work with it.
Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, I'm talking about these things because we are talking about trying to create sort of a maximum density in the downtown area. We have a main street where buildings, I guess, are pretty close to 60 feet. So if someone wanted to do a 70-foot structure, it wouldn't look out of place particularly, especially if it was well done, the facade. So I assume it's kind of a peculiar situation where a fire department seems to be making zoning regulations by what, even though we're saying.
Yeah, well, in many cases, there are aspects of development that are frequently given, the fire department's given a chance to have a review of and provide commentary back on. That sometimes happens with roads and driveways as well, to make sure that they can provide access. So they're given an opportunity to review and provide feedback. They're not the issuing party necessarily on the permit, but I think it's a pretty well-established fact that if they come in and say we can't provide adequate service to this, then there's going to be serious questioning of whether that should be permitted if it can't be safe.
Zoning's a matter of public safety, and it's not safe, then not only would the building not be able to be approved and safe, but the DRB would be responsible for approving something that, according to the fire department, wasn't safe. And on top of that, I bet you the builder wouldn't be able to get insurance
Right.
if the fire department couldn't address it.
There's so many things that fold together here. So for instance, this building, which is, 5 stories and then is sprinkled and has, there's more than one way of achieving a certain level of
A fire safety.
A fire safety.
Other than a ladder truck.
Yep.
Okay, that answers this.
Right.
To me, it seems to be even more intense than that, because it isn't just that the fire department is creating some input into the zoning regulations, but it's also creating input into the town budget. Because if what's safe, whatever is the safe height that the fire truck can reach, that means we need to have more and more expensive fire trucks and bigger fire truck buildings. So there's a real intense a structure that all comes together. If we're going to have building height as a function of what we can reach with a truck, then it impacts what the town budget is.
But it's not the fire department that's demanding that.
If we're saying that we're not making,
It's the proposed building would have an impact on the budget, not the fire department. Because the fire truck is what it is.
well, no, not really. I mean, we could have regulations that say we only have 2-story buildings. And then we would be able to have much less expensive fire trucks, because they would only have to reach.
We could, but right now, we're providing service to buildings that are,
We have 6-story buildings.
right, so the biggest challenge, I think, to be really clear about it, the biggest challenge for the fire department is basically the block from High Street to Elliott Street on the eastern
Because
side
there's
of
no way
Main
to
Street.
reach the backside.
It's 3 stories on the Main Street side, and it's a further 4 stories or 5, 4 stories below. So from a technical standpoint, that's the most challenge, and with the railroad track. And it's and they're old buildings. But there's sprinkling in most of them by now, and alarm systems, and the fire department's comfortable that they can make a reasonable response. The Brooks House obviously is a pretty recent example of an old building that had partial sprinkler system functioning and other issues. And, it was a challenge. But I guess what I'm saying is the fire department has the ability to review an application, and if the proposed building exceeded their ability, then they'd be making that pretty clear. Then I would think it's highly unlikely that the DRB would ignore or set aside the fire department's concerns. But, when you look at a modern building constructed this way, there are ways of resolving that are not just about the size of the ladder truck.
I guess my point is that there's a creep that continues to happen as there are more and more regulations. It makes it more and more expensive to build, which is one of the reasons it's hard to build.
Right.
And more expensive for the town budget, because you have to have,
The apparatus.
so
Yeah.
it's just scary as this little creep of regulations increase. They're not just guidelines, these are law, they're regulations.
Right.
This isn't an increase.
No.
We're 60 feet now.
You're 60 feet now.
Right.
So
Yep.
we're staying the same.
Right.
Yeah, I guess I'm going beyond what
Okay.
your
Yeah.
question was, and I'll stop.
Well, I did want to come back around to this example. There is one more element here I did want to mention before I moved on. There is a standard in the Urban Center for ground floor transparency, so basically to make sure that buildings have windows along the ground floor so that maintain the pedestrian-friendly oriented streetscaping. And this building, for instance, here, has about 70% of that ground floor elevation is glass or windows or doors. So we are requiring somewhere between 60 and 90% transparency at that ground floor level in the urban center area. And that's very consistent with what would be a storefront design. Most storefronts are going to easily fall within that percentage. So as a second example, we looked at this at the Brooks House. Obviously, we have, once again, they have a pretty large lot. They have almost an acre of land there, so much more than the 2,000 square feet minimum. The 175 feet, and that was just on the Main Street side, right? Yeah. 100% build out again, so the building is occupying the full frontage of the lot. 5-story building. It's a 22,000 square footprint, and with the combination of the heights of the various stories and the area of the various stories comes up to an 81,480 floor area. So that actually comes back down to a 1.9 floor area ratio. So I think the point to be made is that this is a fairly large and massive building. It is on a good-sized lot, and is still well below the 4 floor area ratio max. So it is possible to get a building with more than 4 floors in significantly under that floor area ratio here in the downtown. So the next district that we're going to look at is the mixed-use district. This is sort of a transitional area between the core of the downtown and the more established residential neighborhoods. In different parts of town, the areas that are in this mixed-use district have a little bit of different character. There's some that are very residential in character, some parts. There are some parts that have residential buildings but have been converted entirely into office or professional building type uses. There is also some more commercial-oriented components in this district, and there's some industrial buildings in this area as well. These are areas that have evolved over time. They've changed what they have been used for. The draft regulations are somewhat changing that trajectory to try to point them in a slightly different direction, particularly the areas that have been a little more industrial and more commercial without a residential component, towards more towards a residential and mixed in with non-residential uses, but basically bringing back more neighborhood character and more compatibility with the residential neighborhoods that abut this. So what we're looking at in these areas, a fairly high lot coverage of 80%. Buildings set fairly close to the street. They have to be at least 10 feet, but not more than 40 feet back. Somewhere between 50 to 80% of the frontage built out. At this point, we have a 4,000 square foot maximum building footprint. We have been hearing some feedback in this area that might be a little too low. 2 to 4 story buildings, so it'd have to be at least 2 and could be up to 4. This is an area where we've got 2 different floor area ratios. One is for mixed-use buildings, so that would be a building that has both a commercial and a residential component in it, and a lower floor area ratio for a building that's just going to have a non-residential use in it. The idea is to incentivize those mixed-use buildings because you can get a much more building area on a lot if it's going to be mixed use. A residential density of 18 dwelling units to the acre is the maximum, and no parking in the front of the building. So parking in this area would have to go to the side or rear of the buildings. So the basic idea, try to keep it somewhat in scale and character with the residential neighborhoods, but provide some flexibility for creative uses, diverse land uses. Pedestrian-oriented is really sort of important because it's so close to downtown. So you can see some of the elements that are being looked at in the illustrations, the idea being to try to create buildings that have something of interest going on in the front, things like porches, awnings, storefronts, stoops, bay windows, things like that, that really create buildings that are more than just basic, simple boxes and provide interest to the street. So again, we're going to look at some examples of what these numbers look like on the ground. And as I said before, this is a district that's got a diversity of different types of buildings and development in it now. So this is an example of the Daily Shoe Building that is a former industrial building that has been adaptively reused for housing and office purposes. It's on a fairly good-sized lot, 64,000 square feet, and the district requires 6. It's got quite a lot of street frontage as well, much more than is required. The build-out along the street is about 54%, which is close to what is the minimum required, just a little over. 2 stories, so it fits in with the 2 to 4 stories. Where it doesn't fit is in the footprint component. Because this is a former industrial building, it is a lot larger in scale than the residential scale that's sort of envisioned for the future. So it really comes down to a building like this can have new life, can have new purpose, can be reused, but do we want to see more buildings of this scale and massing built here in the future? And so as the regulations are drafted now, the future would be moving slightly away from this towards a more residential scale of development. Floor area ratio here of 0.6, well within the allowed up to 2. And the density from a dwelling unit per acre point of view is pretty close. It's just slightly over the 18 at 19 dwelling units per acre, so pretty much indicative of sort of the maximum residential development that you could get in this area. So then we'll look at a more residential scale example from Terrace Street. This is obviously a historic residential structure. It's now got 7 dwelling units in it. And at that level of housing in there, that actually comes out to 14 dwelling units to the acre, which a little bit below the 18 maximum. It's about a half-acre lot. It doesn't have quite as much frontage build-out as we were envisioning in this district. It's sort of got that narrow end facing up to the street, and there's more width of the building, but that's further back, so it wouldn't count towards the frontage. It is 2 stories. The footprint at about 3,600 square feet is just a little bit under the 4,000 square foot maximum, so it is sort of indicative of the scale of building that is being envisioned more in the future of this district. So then we come to the residential neighborhood. This is really a neighborhood that's located in a large area of town, so not only in the immediate environs of downtown, but it also encompasses much broader residential areas, and it really is a setup for quite a different range of different types of housing. So while in the areas immediately around downtown, they sort of have more of a traditional residential neighborhood, single-family homes, that some of them now multifamily mixed in. But it also allows for townhouse-type development, or it would allow for row houses, other types of housing possible here. But the idea being really to promote compact, walkable neighborhoods at a somewhat high to moderate density, focusing a lot on the neighborhood character and quality of life aspects, things, like looking at what's going on with the front yards and making sure that they're not getting turned into parking lots and things like that. It's also important to point out that the standards that are in the zoning that relate to the buildings and the frontage and the parking and things like that generally apply to multifamily residential developments and typically will not apply to single and 2-family homes. Those do not have to go through site plan review, and so most of the standards about design components don't apply to the single and 2-family homes.
Question?
Mm-hmm.
Was there a consideration given to something that would allow for somewhat expanded commercial use of stores at corners in residential neighborhoods?
So that is actually one of the areas that the Planning Commission has been looking for feedback. The draft actually allows for a small shop up to 2,000 square feet in the residential neighborhood as a conditional use. There's been some discussion of whether that should, because the residential neighborhood is such a large district, and there's obviously places in there that are suitable for the various sort of thing that you're talking about, and areas that are completely not suitable for it. So there has been discussion of whether there should be language in there that limits the locations to, like you're talking about, a corner or main arterial street or something like that, so that a shop or store doesn't show up at the end of a dead-end street, in an inaccessible area, creating a lot of traffic that wasn't there before for the neighbors to enjoy, that type of thing. So that is certainly something that I think we're looking for feedback on for people who live in these neighborhoods. Obviously, there's some pros of having convenient access to shops like that, neighborhood shop, market. There's also the potential for, it to not work so well or to increase traffic or things like that. So, your thoughts?
Well, the only thought that, along with that, was if there was an allowance made for corner stores, that there be somewhat of a wider variety of businesses that could go in. Right now, they seem to kind of be limited to small grocery store type things, but a yarn shop, a coin shop, a plumbing shop, I don't know what, but I think it would more depend on what it looked like than what it was doing.
So right now, as in the draft, an office or a shop, and there's no specificity about what the shop is selling, up to 2,000 square feet is a conditional use in the residential neighborhood district. It also has to be in conjunction with a residential unit, so there would have to be a dwelling unit in the same, on the same property as the store or office use as well.
Okay.
We received some feedback at the last workshop that some folks in the residential neighborhood weren't too comfortable with that possibility. And I think it's very, obviously, there's some locations, like I said, that it could work smoothly and some that may be more problematic, but, yeah. So let me see, where did I leave off? So, okay, in terms of the dimensional standards in this area, there's a maximum coverage of 70%, a 15 to 40 foot front setback, so the building would have to be at least 15 feet back and not more than 40, so creating sort of that traditional front yard and a little bit of a consistency along the street. The 4,000 square foot footprint stays in here, and a building's a maximum of 3 stories and 12 dwelling units per acre. This moving to a dwelling units per acre in the residential neighborhood is a little bit of a different approach to density than the current zoning. Currently, you have a 6,000 square foot minimum lot size, and you can have, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Rod or Sue, 1 or 2 houses on the 6,000 square feet, or 1 or 2, like a single family or a duplex on the 6,000 square feet. And then after that, for the third unit and up, you have to keep having to add 2,000 square feet for
Yes.
each additional unit.
That's correct.
So that, I got the math right. That essentially creates a sliding scale so that multifamily can get more dense over time. You can get up to about 20 dwelling units to the acre eventually through that system. So setting this at 12 dwelling units per acre is probably a little more dense than most of the single family neighborhoods that are still primarily single family are, but it may be a bit less dense than some of the existing multifamily that's in these areas. But it's sort of that middle of the ground, middle road area of density for these neighborhoods. And then there are also some opportunities through the planned unit development provisions, which I talked about in another presentation in more detail, to get more density, potentially 150 to 200% of that for different types of planned unit developments. Okay, did we change there? Okay. So I did throw in the picture here of the bed and breakfast, and that's sort of an example of that type of small business is a possibility as well. And home businesses and occupations are potential in the residential neighborhood too. So look at some examples that would be typical in the residential neighborhood. This example here, a 22,000 square foot lot, a little bit, about half an acre, a little more. With, once again, the minimum being 6,000. 85 feet of street frontage, 60 is the minimum. The front setback is just about 15 feet precisely on this building, so this is a pretty good example of that minimum front setback. That building is covering about 43% of that lot frontage line. We're requiring 30%, 2 stories, plus the little cupola. And it's a 3,200 square foot footprint with 4,000 being the max. There's 6 dwelling units in there, so that gives it pretty much precisely 12 dwelling units to the acre. So it's a good example of what that maximum density would look like, or could look like.
There's actually about 12 units in there.
Well.
If you look at the front door, it shows 6. If you walk around the back, it'll show you 6 more.
Well, then, it would be over the 12 dwelling units per acre number.
It's a nice building.
It
though.
would be over
Fits.
then. And it's not consistent with the records.
So, here is another example of a residential. This one, a smaller lot, about 14,000, almost 15,000 square feet, about 82 feet of street frontage. This one, I think I missed this one because it's more than 15 feet back. I forgot to change that one in the setup. I think this one was actually closer to 25 or so feet back. 38% coverage, a little bit over 2 stories because you've got a little bit of that 3rd floor space up there. 1,500 square foot footprint. There's 3 dwelling units in there, so that comes to about 8 dwelling units to the acre as the density of that building. So that's my walkthrough of the standards for the downtown and the surrounding neighborhoods and what's changing and what's staying the same. So any other questions or comments we can delve into? Yes?
What triggers property that's conforming under the existing standards to need to change under the new standards?
So,
At what point does that property owner need to change?
So it depends to some degree on what it currently is and where it is. So in many cases, what's going to trigger the need to come into conformance would be something that they would have to come in and get a permit and go through site plan review. So that's probably the biggest trigger point is site plan review. In some of the cases, it varies also by aspect. I have recorded a presentation that's going to be up at some point on BCTV that talks a little bit about redevelopment and what triggers the need for review. So for instance, in outdoor lighting for a commercial property, that would need to be upgraded to meet the standards at the point of needing a new site plan review for some reason. But that, fixing lighting could be a fairly simple matter of replacing out bulbs and things like that. So it's not quite as significant a investment usually needed to come into conformance with the lighting standards. Whereas dealing with something like access, needing to change your access into the property from the road, that's a more significant change to the property. It may or may not be something that's actually being proposed to be changed as part of a proposed project. And so the language there is more flexible about meeting, doing the best you can to meet the standards, but not necessarily requiring full conformance. So there's flexibility room in there. In some cases, when the use is going to change, if there's going to be a change of use within an existing building, that would trigger needing the site plan review. It depends on the use and district what triggers that site plan review to some degree. But in most cases, it's the site plan review. I don't know. Yeah.
I don't at all disagree with the direction in which you're going. I don't find anything that I don't agree with. What frightens me is that all of those triggers, for some people it will be nothing, but for many, many people in town, mostly business owners, I can see the extra cost of hiring professionals to do the site plan review, the time it takes to go before the DRB, et cetera, of slowing the progress of building in town down even more than it already is.
And I understand that concern. I think I would say that the regulation changes themselves probably aren't going to change what requires site plan review that much over what's currently requiring site plan review. So people under the current regulations making those changes would probably still have to come in for site plan review. Might what they have to do in order to be approved under site plan review change? That might change, but the necessity of going through that process isn't really changing. And in fact, in some of the districts, we've actually made a lot more uses permitted than conditional, which should lower that bar in some places for some people and some uses. A little.
In my case, that's not.
Maybe not for you.
Not even close to true. And I'm sure there would be, it's an exception, but still, it's hugely frightening.
Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit more, Dennis?
Well, for example, where I'm conforming now under previous regulations, I'm non-conforming under new regulations from the point of view of setbacks, building heights, parking, freestanding signage. I can go on and on.
Okay.
And so, and use, which means that I can see hiring a full-time person to do nothing but go for the DRB. For every change I have to make to come under, to conform to the new regulations. And I know that's probably an exception, but that's a lot. I mean, I said it, it's setbacks, it's heights, it's parking, it's a size of building, signage.
Okay.
A huge number of things have changed. And every change I make, I'm going to have to go before the DRB. I think.
Well, there's some aspects that
Right.
you talk about there that you're protected. I mean,
Right.
the size of your building.
As long as I don't change.
Well, you-
But if I make a change to the
if you're going to
building.
demolish the building that you have, then it would.
What if, well, that's what I was wondering about triggers. Or what if I change use of one of, I mean, for example, one of the buildings is 14,000 square feet instead of 12,000 square feet max. Now I change the use of one tenant out of 6 that are in the building.
You don't have to
Does
take
that
2,000.
trigger it?
You don't have to take 2,000 square
No.
feet off the building. You can
Okay.
continue to have a 14,000 square foot building.
What triggers it?
Until you demolish that building, you would not.
Okay,
You-
I mean,
you
that
could-
that takes a lot of fear away.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
And
even the sign package, at some point, you know, your tenants change out or whatever, and you need to do something about the sign.
Well, for example, the Department of Probation and Parole. I mean, there's a freestanding sign there, and it's always been, and the same thing with Roller Room.
Right.
Well, they're kind of necessary.
Yeah, the directional signs,
But-
as much as anything else.
If I change, and they have lists of several different tenants. If I change one of those tenants and need to change that sign,
No.
do I have to take the whole sign down?
no.
Ah!
Until you want to replace that whole sign.
This is why,
then it would need-
I'm glad you're taking time to elaborate, because no, I mean,
Yeah.
basically,
This makes me feel a whole lot better.
you should operate with the kind of general assumption that if you go changing more than 50% of anything, we're probably need to be aware, I mean, you know, but,
Well,
no,
that-
I mean,
That's
if
freestanding
life,
sign
That's
exists
always
until
been
you
the
want to
case
replace
anyway,
it.
so I'm not afraid of that.
Right.
And I've already been
Right.
going in the direction that
right.
you're
If-
pointing anyway.
If
so
somebody
I'm not
takes the
afraid.
sign out, if a truck backs over your sign and squashes it, yeah, we're gonna need to talk. But if, you know, 2 tenants leave in the space of a month, and you go out there and paint over and take the board off, paint it, and put the new logo for the new tenant on, or sign, that's fine. You know
And
what I mean?
then, the same with the parking, I mean, in your current configurations
Yeah.
on those buildings.
Well, it's all
pretty
shared,
constrict-
it's all shared parking and
Right.
for a lot of different buildings. But
Yeah, I mean, ideally, like, you know, we don't want parking in the front, we want it on the side and the back,
Yeah.
but we're not gonna say to Hannaford, it's like,
Yeah,
You
Yeah.
gotta
right,
move your parking.
right.
because-
Exactly.
Because it's not, that's one of those things.
No,
that
I mean, that's another
it's not.
example. It's not like Hannaford's goes to change 2 parking spaces and we make them reconfigure the entire parking lot. It's like, at some point, you know, with a major rearrangement of that parcel or something, then we'd have, you know, then that would be one of the things that we would be reviewing. But I look at Hannaford's and think, that parking lot is pretty much gonna stay that way, regrettably.
Unless they get some infill development or
Well,
something.
For a
if
really
I-
long
if-
time.
If I owned it, it would be,
Yeah.
I would totally agree that there should be some residential mixed in there.
Right.
In that parking lot.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And, you know, if they, you know, wanna put a restaurant in the front of it or something, you know, then that's a moment then when we would say, okay, so let's review the parking. But if it stays pretty much the same as it does, as you're looking at it today, nothing's really gonna happen. So there was some, I think at the early meeting, there was some, you know, there's a way in which technically there's sort of more uncertainty in when you know for sure that you've got a non-conforming building or, you know. But I'd say, even from a sales standpoint, you know, the zoning ordinance exists, the zoning bylaw exists to give guidance to the current owner and any prospective owner. And so, you know, it's not immediately, I wouldn't conclude immediately that it's gonna have any damaging impact on your ability to sell or those kinds of things.
So sale is not necessarily a trigger either.
No,
No,
no.
Okay.
no. I mean, you could sell, or, you know, Laura could take it over and, and I should, yeah, just imagine that. So, and it could stay exactly the same as it is now. You know, now, if one, you know, until somebody wants to do something fairly major.
Yeah. I get I'm now getting the feeling that there are fewer sticks. I mean, the carrot and the stick thing.
Right.
I had the feeling that there were an awful lot of sticks and some carrots because of higher density, for example.
Right.
I mean, I'm sure to a certain extent that's a stick. But have you had the discussion of the carrot and stick, especially for somebody like me who eventually, slowly are going to have to begin conforming in a direction that
I think
I will
there was a
need to-
little bit of that, for instance, with discussing having the 2 different floor area ratios for mixed use versus a single use, a single non-residential building. I mean, that's a carrot idea, is that you can get more building area if you do mixed use. So that's one such example. And the PUDs have that with the density increases that go along with them as incentives to do those types of
Okay.
designs. So
Right.
there's some carrots.
Yeah, it's a bag of pretty, you know, like the little baby carrots. But,
Okay.
I mean, I would even say that the neighborhood center concept, which does take, you know, some of your area into consideration, would enable a much broader set of uses that could be complementary and could be bad. And, you know, I think are more consistent with the direction that the market is going or could potentially go in. So therefore, that itself is it.
That was one of the scary
Okay.
parts, was
Right.
that as you're looking for commercial tenants,
Right.
there aren't many.
No.
So if all of a sudden you need to look for a particular kind of tenant,
Mhm.
where, so that you're limited in what tenants you can find, it's scary to own a big building or a big property and have a big mortgage, and now all of a sudden you're limited as to what you can find for tenants to
Right.
go into that property.
Right.
It's a frightening place to be.
Do you feel like you're more limited?
That I'm more what?
Do you feel like you're more limited under the draft regulations? Or it's just concern?
Oh, yeah, because most of my property has been commercial, even though I have been moving it more towards water and recreation and residential work, but still, it's been zoned mostly commercial. And if have to limit the type of tenant mix that comes in,
Right.
I might be in a little more trouble finding tenants. It doesn't sound like I have to be as frightened as I was.
I would encourage you not to be that bright.
Okay.
Yeah. I would say, like, as a planning professional, I'm probably not really supposed to say this, but Brattleboro has a very slow or very low rate of change, and people are very sensitive to any little change. And so this is a fairly abstract thing that's serious and important. We're changing the guidelines for development. We're changing the rules for development. We definitely need to do that. But in terms of how much you're going to see walking or driving around, it's going to take a long time for this to kind of work its way through.
Does everybody who is working in this group plan to stay here for a few years?
Yeah, sure.
So that at least we know that we're dealing with rational human beings.
Right. I mean, you know, the contrast would be being somewhere like in the south or in the southwest where there's incredibly fast growth, and the transition is from, you know, open fields to instant suburbs overnight. And we don't have that issue, and there's good and bad things about that issue. On the other hand, we could work very diligently here and persuade the select board and everybody else that this is where we're going to go, and it's going to take quite a while for people to be able to walk around and go, oh, that's what that meant, and that's good, or that's not so good. It'll take a while here for these changes to really be evident in the streetscape.
I also like to encourage people, you know, I think as evidenced in Brattleboro, you know, for our base zoning is 30 years old. There's not, you know, there's been little tweaks here and there, but
Right.
I like to encourage people not to be afraid to, you know, tweak it if we need to if something is not right. Let's not wait another 30 years, you know. So
Right.
I think Vermont has a good process of kind of being able to do that quickly, so.
Yeah, for instance, if we're in Massachusetts, the notion that you could, in a 3-month period, make an amendment to your zoning bylaw is pretty laughable. It would be more like 3 years. So, you know, there are, yeah, you know, from that standpoint, even with the new rules in place, if we recognize that we need to make an adjustment, we can do that. We're not using a chisel
And writing it in stone. And that's actually fairly typical once you do a comprehensive
Right.
overhaul. Is you run some applications through, and there's going to need to be a few tweaks.
Right.
So I would anticipate that that's likely to happen. You have a question
Would
for
you
that?
flip back to the downtown district zoning map?
Yep. There
Have
we
you
are.
got
Do you
one of
want
those,
do you want the today or the proposed?
Have you got this thing?
Yeah, that's what this is. Pretty close to that.
Okay. Have you got one of those little laser pointers?
Yep, I do.
Good, and I can show you what, so you'll see what I'm going to.
The red button on top.
Asking. How does it work?
The red button on top there.
Okay. This area right here, looks to me like it's residential neighborhood, and it really looks and feels like it should be a mixed use. Back here on Brook Street, that's purely residential. Anything commercial happening on this street right here would look out of place. It looks about as neighborhood as you can get. This side looks as commercial as you can get, although there may be some residential stuff here. Now, you probably don't want to make a boundary line down through the middle of it, but maybe you could. But it's certainly, that area in here certainly suggests that it would be better as a mixed-use neighborhood than a residential neighborhood. It doesn't look very residential.
And I would say that the mixed-use district is one of the ones that the Planning Commission has been hearing a fair amount of feedback on, and is probably in this next round of going through and looking at, we're going to be focusing in on this one a little more and giving it a second eyeball. So any and all feedback appreciated.
Spoon, did you, alternatively, were you suggesting something that should be, is more residential, completely residential?
Yeah, well,
You said back here.
if you go to the white line in the back, that's Brook Street.
This is Brook.
Yep. Yep, and that
Well, what's
runs,
that
that
white
runs
line
along,
there?
that's
Oh,
the
that's
district.
just the district, that's the whetstone, actually.
Oh,
Yep.
okay, okay.
Because this is.
Well, that's just the slope and all that.
Yeah.
Well,
It's actually down to the, so you're saying Brook Street is more completely residential, but the area on
Yeah.
Canal in between.
and interestingly, that Brook Street area Brook Street itself
Right.
looks totally resident. There is nothing but nice, old, quaint residential houses on it. Nothing but. So, but on the other side, on the Canal Street side, it's virtually all commercial. So, and like I said, that area just to the northeast of it,
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know why, that might be a mixed-use area.
Final thoughts or questions? Yes.
Do you guys have a determination of how much parking is required for the use of the urban area?
So in the urban center district?
Yeah.
So there is no requirements for parking, for off-street parking in the urban center because of the availability of public parking. There isn't any need to
But
create
is there-
new parking.
Is there a sufficient amount of public parking for what's going on downtown?
One of you guys should answer that one.
I would like to say in broad terms, yes. So it's seasonally, variable. In winter, the parking garage is free overnight. So from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. basically, or 7 a.m., you can park in the parking garage.
And
Now-
that's utilized pretty well?
Yes, it is, actually, by many residents who then, find somewhere else for their car during the day. Now, the challenge is you could be right on the edge of the urban center and have small children or groceries or something and find the whole thing of coordinating how to get all your stuff inside your apartment or your house and then go and moving your car to the parking garage or something pretty challenging. And people often say that, but in general, it's understood that the reason why we don't charge for parking overnight in the parking garage is to accommodate,
To get cars off the street?
yeah, particularly during a snowstorm. And then the idea is that for the remainder of the year in particular, that there's enough places for people to park their cars. And that many people in the downtown area in the urban center don't actually have a car. And so it's less of an issue than you might think, yes.
I know I found a few times more recently that sometimes I've gone downtown for an event or something and had a lot of trouble finding parking spots. I've had to go pretty far out
Right.
to get a parking spot.
Okay. I think it's,
Like even to, that lot, like if you go down Flat Street,
Mhm.
there's the garage, and then across the street, there's that
Yep.
pay one. And then you go further down, then there's
Yeah.
that shopping mall that after hours,
Yes.
people can park, and that will be completely packed too. So it's like, but I guess maybe just a lot's happening in Brattleboro.
I've had that experience of being downtown on a Saturday night with the
Yeah,
same thing.
and there's just a
yeah,
lot of different
It's
things that
frustrating, but I
yeah.
think it's a good sign.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I
There's
mean, I
something
didn't
going
know
on.
as far as planning, if there was any plans to do anything to change the parking situation.
Broadly, no, partly because we don't want cars to dominate the landscape more than they already do.
Mhm.
And we certainly don't want people to rip up the last remnants of green in their yards or whatever and turn it over to parking spaces.
But people need to park in order to get to the stores and stuff. Is there potential, years down or whatever, to add more floors to the parking garage if needed?
Not so much beside it, actually.
Oh,
There's
beside
a piece of land
That's a possibility.
that's a possibility, yeah.
Just questioning
Yeah,
for future.
right. I would say that the general idea is highly variable, and there are times at night, for instance, when it's hard to find a parking space, but I think in general, the impression that people have is that the parking system is adequate for the level of demand now, and we probably, in the long term, think that there'll be less car use rather than more. So the pressure that we would probably experience, I think, before that is actually accommodating bicycles more downtown. You know, weatherproof, locked storage for bicycles, something similar, which we don't actually have a requirement for in the new bylaw or a program for addressing, but I suspect
We
that's.
have bike racks, but not.
We have bike racks,
right
but-
there, right, so,
Okay.
yeah.
And I have another question separately, is about the historic district. Is the downtown area, like Main Street, a historic district? And what are the boundaries of that?
Yes. I do have a paper map here somewhere that
Yeah.
shows the boundaries, I think in my other bag, and I could pull it out when we're done and show it to you, but yes, a good, a portion of the, this red area is in one of the historic districts. There's one for West Brattleboro Village, correct?
Yes.
And there's two little neighborhoods down here somewhere.
There's the Clark Canal and
Yeah.
the Horton Homestead, which are off of Canal Street.
The what?
Horton Homestead?
Oh, that's a
It's,
historic, that's one of the historic.
Yeah.
Yes.
And with that, like I was under maybe a misconception or whatever, that if there was some new buildings being built, like, for instance, when the Rite Aid went out and there was a new building built there, or like with the co-op or whatever, that it was supposed to kind of blend in with the existing population. Is that not true? Like just the outside of
The current, the co-op site is not in the historic district.
it? Okay.
Right.
So it
and-
wasn't required to make any effort to do that?
Well, I think the structure of the building might be contemporary in form. I think the materials and the color palette are consistent with the historic district actually. So I don't think there was no need for them to strictly adhere to historic building.
Or just, yeah,
Plus it
the
was a
look
new
of it,
building.
Yeah.
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 Well, yeah, I'm just talking about the look of it, not so
Right.
much historic materials.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
And the same with when the Rite Aid.
Yeah, well, the
I
River
mean,
Garden
that
does
was
seem
also
to
new.
blend in, it has some modernistic look to it, but at the same time, it has some older, it has kind of a
Right.
gable
Right.
roofy thing on it,
Right.
it has some.
Yep.
I'm curious as to why there's not a water, what's it called?
Water and Recreation District?
South of.
There is a little piece that runs along from on the railroad to Riverside, and then when it gets down here further, it does broaden out a little bit, but that's fairly constrained on the side by the railroad, so.
Yeah.
Is that the area you're thinking of?
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the changes that we're proposing too, though, is in the Depot Street area. So this is zoned industrial now, and so it's
Yeah,
proposed to
look at
be
it.
mixed use.
Yeah.
Right.
So this
The-
area would change there.
Right. The challenge there, as you know, Dennis, is that the railroad tracks basically block ready access to the riverfront there. Its prior use is kind of a consideration, to say the least. And the riverbank is actually quite high at that point. So easy access to the actual river itself is not great. As you come further down, it tapers. So accessing the river down here is a lot easier, for instance, than accessing the river right here. And then lastly, if I've got this right, right now this is the bridge. And it does something like this. And then the new bridge will actually, which is going to just touch this tip and then come straight across. And yeah, you'll see it from here. It'll be right there. Which then changes the configuration of this whole area in here quite dramatically. And so I think just given the grade and other conditions, you'll probably be able to get a view of the river, but not actually access it, if you can follow that distinction.
The taxi company was suggesting a taxi from the new neighborhood center district to the down water taxi.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that's,
But there needs to be a place to land.
well, yeah.
I think depending on what happens with the bridge, I mean, I think.
Yeah, I think
it's-
that's a possibility.
It's further down than the town would plan would be easier to access.
Right. I think having some kind of rope that you can attach to the side of the Whetstone station and climb up, I think is,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, rope ladder.
yeah, rope ladder. Okay.
Out of curiosity, what's the latest news on the bridge change?
New Hampshire's a little more consistent than Vermont is when they make commitments like this, and the last time I checked,
It's in New Hampshire's 10-year transportation.
Yes.
plan,
I
which
saw that.
is big to get it in,
Yeah.
it's very big to get it in.
but I think, is it
2018 is,
2018, maybe starting right away and that kind of thing, and I think 2021, maybe they'd start construction.
right. So it takes about 2 years to get the drawings together and do the right-of-way at the same time as things kind of start together, the final drawings and the right-of-way purchase. New Hampshire's very brisk relative to Vermont with right-of-way purchases. And we haven't heard anything from Vermont about what they're going to do once the bridge turns up. And I say it like that because in fact, our experience with the Chesterfield Bridge was that the bridge literally did turn up, and Vermont took a year to join Vermont to the bridge.
Another use for those ropes.
Yeah, we're really good with roads now.
I was also curious about downtown, because to me, downtown's one of the reasons I moved here. I love
Okay.
downtown, and I'm always thinking, I wish there were more of this, because
Right.
a lot of those restaurants, and I love them. But I noticed that the boundaries changed to reflect where downtown currently is. And if I think about growth, is the hope that there would be growth in terms of more density downtown, or that there would be growth in a way that's consistent with the mixed use, spread out a little bit from that, or that growth would basically be a function of turnover of what's there now, or how do we see that?
Take us-
Well, I think the physical change in the boundary was triggered by making those dimensional standards a lot more specific and precise, so that they're really dictating building, that block building type of development. So that sort of necessitated bringing that to the boundaries of where that is. And then I think the idea behind this mixed-use district, and it might not be 100% there yet, is to provide that room for growth, but not quite in the same form
Right.
as is right in the downtown, but still within enough proximity that it's very walkable and within the surrounding neighborhoods walkable. So to try to get that mid layer, so between the residential neighborhood and the downtown.
Yeah, I think we want to be careful of not getting too far out in front, because I think we all want the growth,
Sure.
but the numbers aren't necessarily there now, so we also don't want to deplete
Yeah.
what's downtown by expanding it too much, so.
The town plan speaks quite a bit to not providing a lot more retail space than currently exists in Brattleboro, just based on what market demand is, and that you're really just taking away from what's already there here if you keep adding more.
Right, yeah, it's true. And then, I think that scale-wise, to be able to live in these neighborhoods to some extent here in a fairly low-density, traditional sort of residential neighborhood, but be just a couple of blocks from this, is actually one of the more appealing features. And so if there was an effort to somehow expand this kind of density in this direction, we'd lose a lot of that really pleasant, overtly residential natured kind of neighborhoods. And so we, in discussing the boundaries, the Planning Commission talked at length about how, we have an interest in sort of protecting this general area just to the west of the downtown and kind of enhancing its residential nature more than.
There's also, there's a physical boundary there too.
Right.
That's where the land slopes up there quite a bit, which is probably why it's played out.
Yeah, I think the topography's had a really big role in how things have worked out.
Thank you.
I have a similar timing question as the bridge. There were several Department of Transportation meetings about the change of Putney Road, which of course goes along with what we're trying to do with Putney Road.
Yeah.
And they're starting at the Memorial Bridge and going out, they're gonna build sidewalks and bike paths and all. Is there any knowledge about timing on that? It's just kind of out there.
I hear on the grapevine that the small crew of engineers continue to work on the latest iteration of the plans for the actual road. I know that no one has commenced or has even gone anywhere near the idea of right-of-way purchases, which for this project are huge. And because it involves commercial real estate, fairly expensive. And then, Vermont runs a list somewhat like New Hampshire, and it's not on the list. So, in other words, it's not even designated in a particular year, and then the worry or the threat is that it will get pushed back. It's just not even on the list to be pushed back.
But yet we hear,
Yet we hear that there's these little munchkins working away with their...
Because a lot of the things we're trying to accomplish here
Right,
could be accomplished
right.
with that.
Right, I feel we've made repeated representations to V-Trans that whatever they decide to do, is one thing, but just doing it is another, and that we feel like everyone's kind of frozen waiting for something to happen because they realize that it's going to have a very big change. But no one's willing to actually move right now because they're waiting for the change to happen, and then they're going to react to it. So consequently, we get no change.
Okay.
Yeah, and they're like, then they say, how long it takes. And yeah, we don't know. And the short answer is we've got no idea.
An issue in general, if you change, and it doesn't look like any land size, lot size stuff has been changed.
That's very minor.
Yeah.
But what would there be a lot of legal implications that might make it impossible, for instance, to change the rural from 3 acres to 5 acres or 3 to 10 or something like that? Would that constitute, if a person bought a 9-acre piece and intending to divide it into 2, and then all of a sudden the regulations change and they have to have 5-acre minimums, and they can't do that any longer, was that some kind of a taking?
No.
So we could have 10-acre zoning in the rural areas. And was anything like that discussed, having larger? Because it's clear there's an intention to try to draw density into town to protect the rural areas, the environmental stuff, and all of that. So I know that one technique for that is to have larger lot sizes, which of course limits the housing possibilities and development.
As the rural planner that I often am, I like to dissuade people against the larger minimum lot sizes. We have a thing where we say that we create lots that are too big to mow and too small to plow. But the subdivision section of the regulations has taken some efforts to make the density a little more reflective of the road access that the property would have and the natural resources that are on the property. So there's a density system that takes those factors in and then establishes a density. So it's not an automatic one house for every 3 acres in the rural area. It's based on how much buildable land there is actually on that parcel and whether there's a decent road going
Right.
to providing access to that area.
Well, that's
So
it.
it's an alternative method than what you described about the lot sizes that speaks directly to the type of environmental resources on a property.
So you're saying someone's got a 10-acre lot, and somehow it's determined that only 4 acres
Say it's-
are buildable?
Yeah, say 6 acres are very steep slopes.
Right.
Or what?
Very steep slopes, say,
Well, whatever it
whatever.
is.
Yeah.
So, or if they have a 10-acre lot, and 8 acres are slopes or whatever, they're not buildable, that person can't split it and put on 2
Right. If they had 10,
units. You would actually look at that
Yep.
as a 2-acre lot in terms of building.
Yes.
yes.
What about in terms of property tax? Since if you've got 8 acres that you can't do anything with, does that affect your?
No.
Couldn't you cluster and still put 2?
Well, so there is this,
Yes.
there's
Like-
also an alternate. So under a straight subdivision, we would take out, we would say, okay, 8 acres are not buildable, so you get 1 lot. You, pretty sure you'd still be taxed on the 10 acres. But there's the alternative, which is a conservation subdivision PUD, where you would then get the same density, so 10 acres, you could get 3 lots out of it. And then you could cluster them on the buildable parts of the
Got it.
site.
Yep.
So you can still, there is a method to still extract the.
So so your density doesn't really shift. The mode of doing it does. So, you could imagine you could get 3 building lots out of the land now. Under the new conditions, you might not be able to get 3 lots with the minimum parcel size that we're proposing, but you could cluster the homes. And then I think even from a valuation standpoint, it's gonna be a wash, basically. I mean, I should say from personal experience, the parcel we bought was rezoned and, they increased the minimum lot size, thus making it no longer able to be subdivided. It didn't hugely impact the value of the land by the per acre price, and it didn't change it did not, and it didn't change the tax.
And the experience I've seen in towns that have done changes in the zoning is that component that goes into the formula of figuring out the assessed value of property is a very small
It's really-
piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, yep. It's overwhelmingly dominated by the value of the improvements. So the land itself, it's the per acre price, kind of undeveloped, or and that's it. Does that answer your questions, Ben? And,
Yeah.
and frequently,
Sort of.
it's one of those things, because we haven't changed the zoning regs in any major way for a very long time, but other towns around here have changed the minimum parcel size, increased the minimum parcel size, called it a conservation area or something similar, and it just means that overnight, that if you were thinking that you were going to subdivide your parcel into 3, you may only be able to subdivide it into 2. And that's just the way it is, and it's not regarded as a taking, as long as the zoning amendment is done legally.
And we had looked at raising minimum lot size.
That's sort of where we
back during the
started
town
from.
plan.
Right.
But I think through some of the EPA Sustainable Communities
Right, exactly.
Technical Assistance Workshop that we had, we just found other ways that we thought would achieve what we were trying to do in a.
So what we wanted to do was avoid.
Actually, a more direct
Right,
way.
right. We wanted to avoid challenging or putting increasing demands on town infrastructure, particularly emergency service response. We wanted to, and that goes to the question of class 4 roads and being able to develop only with frontage on a class 4 road. We wanted to recognize that continued residential development in areas covered by steep slopes with, you know, steep brooks that go along with them, exacerbated a set of hazard conditions that we saw demonstrated with Tropical Storm Irene. So we wanted to try and find a way of identifying those landscape features that we felt were important to respond to, either from a hazard standpoint or from a environmental protection standpoint. And then come up with a way where we could preserve the working landscape and open space without discouraging development. And so to do that, we've developed the so-called conservation PUD, which would allow for clustering of multiple homes, not right up against each other necessarily, but fairly close to each other, and with a shared access to open space, which would be the area identified as, you know, exhibiting steep slopes.
Yeah, yeah. All right, we'll see what happens when the applications come in.
Okay. We look forward to it. Yeah.
Anything else?
I just have a question that, it's, I'm sure people have thought of already of how the town could be opened up to the river on the east side there. And I guess because of the railroad, that's already been investigated and nothing can be done, or is there any?
It's
is there
very,
any
yeah.
potential at all for that?
It's next to impossible to get a new crossing across the railroad track. It's a very difficult thing. So basically, you need to work with the crossings that you've got across the railroad to get to the river.
Oh, crossings?
To get from the west side of the railroad track to the east side of the railroad track.
Businesses
Oh,
having their fronts
to the back.
Like Arch
and the
Street.
back,
Mhm.
yeah, like
Mhm.
maybe even just the buildings themselves having like, you know,
Right.
porches or
At this point,
boardwalk
yeah.
or something where
Mhm.
they can open out to that
At,
view.
at this point, that isn't something that's required in the draft regulations, but is
Right.
certainly something that could be done under the
So
regulations.
if an owner of one of those buildings wanted to set up something like that, build something
Mhm.
that he could go
Yeah.
through an application.
Yeah, it's getting physically across and over is
Yeah,
the real
no,
challenge,
no.
but
Yeah, that's
opening up the
probably
view
possible,
is
yeah.
certainly more of a possibility, yeah.
But,
I should point out, as a former occupant of one of the buildings on here, it's not just the railroad tracks, there's also a really high
very high up.
voltage electric cable that
Oh.
runs around about the same, just a little bit below street level, all the way along here. And in fact, that's the more major impediment than even doing something about the railroad tracks.
Because I know, like Mocha Joe's, where they roast,
Yeah.
whatever, that used to be a restaurant, I think, there, in the
Um,
back of that, and that has windows that look out to the.
That's imaginable, yeah.
So something like, I was thinking more of things like that, you
Mhm,
know,
sure.
like that. But, yeah.
Yeah, I think all those buildings have got some potential for taking more advantage of that
Okay,
river view, but there's some challenges there.
yeah.
There's
I don't think
something,
there's any impediments.
there's no impediments to doing it.
No.
And there must be something written
In the
into our
regulation.
human DNA that says that food tastes better when we're looking at water. Because the number one thing that I always get whenever I do visioning sessions in communities that have water is that we want to have a restaurant. We can sit out and look at the river, lake, whatever.
Okay. Okay.
It's got to be there.
It's gotta be there.
It's a
Okay.
nice patio.
Right.
Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Well, thank you guys very much for coming out.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's good.
Have some snacks for the road. Oh,
I was looking for a little bit of information here. Water and Recreation District. That's a murky one.
Well, I think the water is okay.
Depends on the water.
And it just, of course, what popped into my mind specifically, it looks like we're underway for a huge solar array there. Would that fit under these regulations?
so the solar arrays generally do not come in for zoning approval, if they go to the Public Service Board and they get a certificate of public good, they're exempt from local zoning. So that, obviously, the utility scale projects, the larger scale projects all do that. And even a lot of the individual homeowner projects do that because they're grid connected, net metered systems. And so those also go to the Public Service Board and they don't need zoning permits either.
Right. So regardless, so to break that down, regardless of what we zone the area, you don't have that map up, but regardless of what we do, if the property owner qualifies for consideration under the Public Service Board, then they do.
Yeah. Also in that same area, looking at the water and recreation in that area that's especially important in the town, the West River area. Yet it says residential uses can happen. It feels like there's a little bit of tension or stress or conflict between this notion of trying to keep that open and natural and accessible by the public, and yet at the same time allowing residential development and all sorts of other things, really. I would have thought along that West River, no residential development. I mean, nothing, just to keep it natural.
I'm zooming it in here, so
Okay.
we can talk about it if you wish.
Okay. Well, it's. Do you mean the Putney Road side? Do you mean the this area in here, which this is Springtree Road? So.
Well, going up along the West River Trail and actually continuing,
It continues up into there.
yeah, that whole, both of those expanded areas in the gray in the water district before you get to the
Right.
91 bridge.
Right.
It would seem to me that there would be no further development along there than there already is.
Well, I think it's probably a kind of a site specific as to whether residential would really be desirable. I mean, this is more of floodplain, so either be
Well, there's
challenges
a house
to doing res-
out there now, of
Yeah.
course, and there's probably, in that area, there's probably possible to squeeze in a bunch more.
And this one up here is a higher plateau, which I think even dating back to the West Brattleboro master plan has kind of been identified as a really nice site for housing because it could take advantage of the beautiful asset that's the West River.
So
So
then
that's,
that might as well be residential. I mean, it almost seems like then the water district should be a fairly thin line with the trail as the boundary and then everything else residential or something.
So the Water and Recreation District takes in several different types of land. It takes in some public lands and parks and things like that. And then it takes in some of these waterfront properties that have the potential to be developed, whether residentially or commercially, but with something that takes advantage of its water asset and location. And that's the reason for putting those developable properties in this water and recreation district, to try to emphasize their taking advantage of that asset that they have.
Right. I mean, I think Brandon said it perfectly.
Well, I guess if you work, and we're working with a 100-foot
Buffer.
buffer zone.
So there are going to be, in these waterfront areas, several layers of issues that come up. There's the floodplain layer that has to be dealt with, and what can be done within any area that's in the floodplain. You know, obviously in some of these areas, there's also some wetland issues as well that comes up.
Much development.
And then the regulations do have the riparian buffers and setbacks that vary by district. So, you know, the likelihood of there being development right up on the water is pretty slim. But, you know, further back
And I
a
think
little
we've
bit.
drawn that the zoning district with those things in mind. And so, as Sue pointed out, this parcel here is basically almost all floodplain impacted, which limits the range, or
Yeah.
certainly the response that you'd make. It's
That's
not
true.
impossible to build on it, but it sets up a set of conditions that are a little challenging. This one is significantly higher, but unlike this one, you begin to have much more access challenges with this one. This is basically here, this is Royal Plaza. There's a big grade shift between here and here, but there's potential for access this way or potentially through here down into this way.
Well, that's where the solar array road will be.
Well, that's
Potentially.
potentially, yeah. I mean, we've not.
Yeah, that's
right.
the.
Right,
parcel.
and so, you know, this land here, doesn't have the same issues because of its height relative to the river and so forth, and it overlooks the trail rather than is, you know, right on the trail. But in general, that's the principle that we're trying to employ here, that this area indeed could be developed
Yeah.
residentially or something similar.
When you go to the next section just north of 91, that's in the water zone,
This one?
right, all up there. Is that now, or do you know how much of that now is owned by the West River Trail Association or anything like that? I mean, it would be nice to zone it so they wouldn't have to buy it. They don't have enough money to work with as it is.
Let me try and figure out
Do
what
you
you.
need-
This is the river. This
I
is
mean, there's
the.
no real road up there, so
It's on the
development
No,
is.
that's
on the
the
other
Route
side of
30,
the
that's
river.
the playing fields.
So are you talking this side of the northeast side of the river?
Oh, okay, I'm mistaken. I'm looking at Route 30 and I'm thinking that's the river.
Right.
Yeah.
This is West River Park,
Yeah,
and
okay.
then this
all right.
is this
Never
is.
mind,
Yeah.
then-
Okay.
then,
And then on this side,
Yeah, that's the park and,
right. And on this on the northeast side,
oh, wait a minute. Is the park north of the bridge?
yeah. This is the bridge, and here's the park.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, then,
And I think the parcel that the West River Trail, it's one of those, it might be off of this map.
Up here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
the,
I think it's a little further down than the West River. It might be like this.
I moved the map.
It might be this, or it could be this one.
Yes, I think it's this one.
Yeah.
Where's the Dummerston boundary?
But that's an interesting
Wait,
way.
do you want me to move the map some more?
Yeah. Let's get to the edge of the planet. Yeah.
Does anyone know if the riparian buffers that are being proposed, are they more restrictive than the state restrictions?
It's a different type of looking at what you can do with it. So the state's got setbacks from the wetlands areas that generally you're not allowed to develop in, that would be fairly consistent with the riparian buffers we're proposing. And then they have their new shoreland provisions, but those only apply to certain bodies of water, so they're not coming down to the smaller streams necessarily and applying. And the underlying principles are kind of the same. The specifics of the application are a little bit different in that what we're proposing, that 100-foot area, it is possible to build in parts of that. It depends on the zoning district, exactly how much of that is going to stay
Because I think
vegetated.
some of it, the state is saying 50 feet.
Yeah,
and
it
we're saying
varies.
100 feet.
Yeah.
It's
So
actually even changed a little bit more now with the river corridor.
with the river corridor, they've come up with something else, yeah. So,
They're up closer, I think, to 100 in one location.
yeah, and they're doing 50 along the little streams.
Right.
So the 100 feet that is set, that we've got as the riparian area in the draft, that's the area that's going to be looked at to see what's going on, what you're proposing to do within it. But only in the rural district, the dark green area on undeveloped land, would you not be able to build anything in that 100 feet. In the other districts, the actual setback zone is smaller. In most of it, it's 25 or 50 feet, depending on whether it's a developed or undeveloped lot. And in the really developed core areas of town, it's like 15 feet. So 10, 15, something like that. So, but there is going to be some looking, if you're within 100 feet, a little like a conditional use review to make sure that we're thinking about how the development is impacting the waterway. Okay. Last call for real this time. Thank you all. Have a good night.
Thank you.